All right, greetings. So I want to talk a little bit about what's in this next week and a half or so. Um, Over on the discussion board, you'll find that there is a discussion board that hopefully you'll find a little more interesting, so make sure you take a look at that. Under your assignments, I've listed a lot of these coding exercises so you can practice these. So there also will give you a lot of ideas about what's going on. So if I go to assignments, those coding snippets, I have a huge number of them in here. And so this is kind of the master of these. So if you want to look at a tuple that we have, here's an example of a tuple or a dictionary or looping through a dictionary. So there's a lot of materials in here. So these are really kind of handy because you can practice and practice and practice. So let's look at lists in Python, for example. I apologize, I wish it would load up a little faster, but I don't get to control that always. So we look at list, how they use the square brackets, and then down at the bottom it actually has some examples of these. So in this case, we have a list called data points, and notice in here we've got coordinates is what we're using. So you can actually play around and experiment and see what's going to happen in the with those when they run. So you can change them. So if I wanted to change this, I could do that, and when it runs, now it's going to have an error. Go, hey, I don't know what the list is because I didn't match this in the list name and that. So we've talked about lists. They're really the other term you might see for them is something called an array. And so if you see that, that really means a list. So a lot of these things in there, and then we have some problems we're going to work on. So if I go back to correct week. So those coding snippets are a great way to try things. So here I've just listed some of them in here that you might want to try as we start working through there. So we've got 4 assignments in here. The case studies you should do. They're going to help you, but they aren't for any points. So don't panic when you don't see them up there. The review doesn't give you any points, but the quiz certainly does. So I want to talk about a couple of things in here. Scroll. So sorting a list, that dot sort we use quite often, and so we're going to use it in some of our codes. So we went through a way to find a median. There's actually a method in here that we can look at, but we're really trying to find that middle number. We talk about tuples. So the difference is tuples is immutable. In other words, it's not changeable. The only difference when we create them, we use the parentheses instead of the square brackets. And there are times that's kind of a handy feature because we don't want the items to be able to easily change. What I'd like to look at though really quickly is a function, because our newest piece we're going to do is we're going to create modules or functions. And so these functions we can then use in multiple pieces of software code. We've created a function. You've used them already. Print is actually a function. When you call print, anytime I have those parentheses, it says, hey, I'm going to start some kind of a function. So I want to talk briefly about functions and kind of show you how some of them are set up. So I'm going to do it in File New. So a function, let's create our own first function. So I'm just going to call this first function. Apparently I have caps lock on. I got to fix that. All right. So to create a function, we have to define it. And so we just type DEF, and notice it turns orange, and the name of our function. So we figured out a way to get a mean. So let's call this one mean. So our program is really going to have three functions: mean, mode, and median. So mean, mode, and median. So we're going to define three different functions for this. So the function, we're going to take in a value from an array or a list. And so I'm going to pass that entire list, when it runs, I'm going to send it into this function. So I can't do list. List is a keyword. So what our book shows you is calling it list. So we still know what it is. It's very descriptive, but it's not a reserved word. So we're going to create one called mean, and it's going to take in our list. So at some point in our function, we're going to create a set of values called list. And so we could actually do that down here. Typically, and this is the typical structure, your functions go at the top of your program, then you have your main function, which calls them, and that's where you also do things like your creation of items, such as, in this case, we're going to create something called list, and we're going to assign it some values. So I just made up some quasi-random numbers there. So I've now created this thing called list. So now I have values that I can run, and so down here, to call this function or make it run, I just have to essentially call it or in some way invoke it. So in this case, I can use my print. Might be one way I could do it. And I could say, which one are we doing? The mean. Mean is, and so I'm just going to put it inside my print statement to call another function. So we're going to call mean, and that mean, I know I have to pass in list. So it has to send that list that we created up here into this function, and when I call this function, it comes up here and runs this code, which we haven't yet defined. So that's what we would end up with. So that calls the function, and so it will print whatever this mean is. Well, now I got to go back and I got to think about what's all in these items. So a couple of odd things we need to probably do is we need to look at that list, and we need to figure out what it's going to total. And so we might call it our sum or our total, either one. Sum, I maybe like total better. Total equals 0. So we want to make sure when we run this function that total is equal to 0. Well, we need to go through that entire list. So we could say for num in list. So in other words, we're going to go through and take each part of that, and then we could say total equals total plus num. Got it. Well, now we have our way to add up those sums. So the next piece we got to figure out is how do we get numbers back out of here? Because even though I created a value and I said total's not available in the mean. So one of the things we do is they're abstract, is a function can't directly see another variable. We have to pass it back out again. And so to pass it back out, we end our function with a return. And in this case, because we're going to return something, we're going to return total. And so that total is going to be passed down into this value inside of here. Okay. So this seems weird. We're going to take this, and when we call this function, it runs this, pulls this data, and then it runs through. All right, so I ran this really quickly, and it looks like, hey, our total is 224. If I change one of these values, so I look and I go, man, I don't think that was really 99. That should be 90 or 81, maybe. I can run this again. And now it says it's 206. So it's adding those numbers up. Now, what I am kind of curious about, what happens if we have a screw up in our program and there's nothing in list? Let's see what happens in that case. And in that case, it says, hey, it's 0 because there isn't anything in that list. So this might be a way we can do that. Great. So we now have, see if I can undo that. Like put some numbers back in there. All right. So that works. It runs. We have our first function. So here we're printing the mean is. All right. We also looked at some other ones. So here we said, here's our mean. We added them together. We would have to divide this to actually get the right number that we're looking for. This is our total. We'd have to divide it by the length of that particular. So that's when we run into one tiny problem. So, and let's look at it. Because we want, really what we want is to return the mean. So that's going to so we could simply say total equals total divided by length of list. All right, and so that's going to give us that average or that mean value. Well, that seems like it'd work really well. I'm going to run it, and it says, oh, it's 20. So we didn't format it. You might want to think about that, but it works until I do this. I jumped ahead of myself there a little bit. So now let's see what happens. And now we get an error. And the reason we get an error, that length is 0, and we can't divide by 0. So what if we took this and we decided we're going to use an if statement? So if length of list, because we can divide by negative numbers if we manage them, but we're really only interested in that 0. So if it's equal to 0, then we're going to say total equals 0. Else, total equals total divided by. So now if I run it, and it says, oh, the mean is 0 because it caught that error and it fixed it. So there might be function 1 that we're going to look at. So we looked at the median and how to do that. We could do something very, very similar where we sorted and we found the mean. The one that's a little tougher that I'd like to work on is the mode. So let's refresh what mode is. Mode is, so we're going to use the same technique here. So mode is the most common item in our list. So we need to probably think about how we can do that. And one of the ways, we could create all different kinds of data structures, but we have this interesting dictionary, and so maybe we want to create that. So one of the things, I don't think I can use just dictionary. Maybe I can. No, but it's not going to yell it. Okay. So we're going to create a new, and notice the dictionary uses the funny squiggle brackets. So we're going to create a blank dictionary, because dictionary has an item and a definition. Well, we're going to use that as item and frequency. So there's actually two elements that are inside there. So we're going to create this kind of on the fly here as we go. So first thing we're going to do is we're probably going to use something like for num in list. So very similar function. That means we pass through every item in that list. We need to think about what's going to happen. So every time we pass a value in, we want to look at it and see if there already is some kind of a grouping. So think about it this way. Let me see if I can make a note here. So it's in our dictionary we're going to create, it's then number, and then the second item is its frequency. So number, frequency. So I can refer back to them, and I can actually, when I go through there, I can actually look at the frequency for each one. If I haven't seen it before, it's going to be 0 or blank. So the other way we can do that is use some of our Boolean numbers, and so we might do that. So frequency, so that's the number that we're going to put in that second part, is equal to dictionary dot get. So we're pulling a value from number. So we're going to, this lets us see, this lets us see if it's in there. And we're automatically going to assign it, and we're going to do a Boolean value called none. So when the first time it hits this, it's going to not have a value. And then we're going to say dictionary so we know the number we're going to put in there. So that is that num. So we know what position it is, but we don't reference it by position. We reference it by that title that it's got. And then we're going to say it's equal to 1. So if it exists, we can do it the first time. But what I really need to do is probably put this in an if-then statement. So let's try that. So if that frequency is equal to none, so notice that it goes through here. The first time it's going to do that, it's going to say none. And so our dictionary is going to have, there we go. So our dictionary, the first time it sees a value, so the first time it sees, oh, I got to put values back in there. So let's put in some numbers. So the first time it sees 2, it's going to be a 0. So first time it goes through, it's going to guess it, and it's going to say, hey, there's a 0. The second time, so if it's not equal to none, so the else part of that, else, then we're going to call it again, so call dictionary. Same thing, so call it for that value. So in this case, the very first number. And then we're going to say it's equal to then that frequency plus 1. Does that make sense, hopefully? So we're trying to give it a value of either 1 the first time we find that number, or we're continuing to add, and we add 1 to it each time. Honestly, I think you could do it where you're just adding 1 each time because it's the only time you get it, but this just makes it a little cleaner and separates that. All right. So when we're done with this, we should have created then a dictionary with all of these items as elements, except for the ones that are duplicated, because we don't have those. But so we would have essentially a value of 2, comma, did I use it 1? It's only once. And you would have a one of 5, comma, 1, 2, 3. So we have a frequency of 3. And you would have 7, comma, 1. So now we could go through there and we could try to figure out which one of those has the biggest value. So the quickest way to do it is we can use those sort routines. So we can also do some other kind of funky things. So now we're going to have to try to find the mode. And if we don't have any that are different, in other words, they're all the same, then we probably need to figure out what we're going to do. So I'm going to use max, come back to the right indent here. So I'm going to use max as a word I'm going to do. Well, let's do that just to make it a little less confusing. And we're going to assign it a value, and we're going to use some of our functions that we've had. So we're going to pull up max, and notice it's a keyword, so it's going to actually look for. And then I'm going to say dictionary dot values. So it's going to go through and search for the value that is the largest in that dictionary. So it's not going to worry about the header. It's going to say, I'm only looking through that max of that. So you could do it with a parallel array, but it's just kind of handy because we get to do that. So now we're going to find the ones that match that particular item. So in theory, we could have more than one item as a mode. If we had 2 items and they both had 10 occurrences, there would be essentially 2 modes there. So I've got to run another for loop, or I could use another loop, but I need to figure out which one it is. So I'm going to use key, that way I know what it is, in dictionary. So it's going to go through, and when it finds one that we've just created, and maybe we can use an if statement inside of our loop, if key so only those values that are inside of our dictionary will run. Equals, what did we call it? Max? Frequency max. And what we're bringing in is that key, because that's what we've said is our highest value. If that happens to be the right one, then we're going to return key. So that'll then pass back up to our out of our function. So these returns down here give us an idea of what can come back out. So the other piece I might want to put in there is I might want to also look at, is there a way that I can eliminate if there's not more than one? So I'm going to add a few pieces possibly, but if I look at this now, return key, and I said print the mode is, now I'm going to say mode list. Hey. So again, I'm passing that value up there into this function. All right, so if I run this, and I changed a couple numbers here real quick. If I run that, my mean works, my mode works, except when I look at this, I have one glaring problem, and for now we're going to ignore it a little bit. So notice here I have 1, 1, 2, 2. But it picks up 1, because the way this works, the very first time that it hits the max frequency, so we could actually have several of them have the max frequency, unfortunately, and we've said only one can, and it starts from left to right, so it's going to pick the 1, 1, and you can see that if I switch that out to, so we're 2, 2, 1, 1. Now it's going to pick that because it runs through those first. So there's a little bit of an issue with that, but we'll get around to coming up with solutions, and you may have already come up with a solution for yourself. So now we've got 2 functions. And then so finally the last one we need to create is that idea of that median. And so we went through some of that. Define median. And so that median then takes your number list and whether you're odd or even. So if you're odd, it could just point to the middle. If it's even, it's got to pick the 2 middle points and divide them by 2. So then you would have down here to call that. And you could assign it another value. So you could assign it to the median is, and then that would be median, and you're passing in that list again. So that's this idea of those functions, and there's a lot more to it. So this is the basic way we run functions. So we're going to make it just slightly more complicated on you. Not horribly, I hope. But I'm going to actually put the main function, so this item's here, I'm actually going to put those in a function, and so I'm going to call that main. And I'm just going to do an open and close, because in this case I'm not bringing anything directly in. So I'm not going to bring anything in. And here's kind of a handy feature in here, so I can then indent that whole region, because that's all going to be inside of there. Trying to make it where you can see it on the screen. So this is all going to be inside of my main function. Well, how do I make then my main function fire? So what we're going to look for is something kind of weird. So we're going to actually create, down here, we're going to have an if statement. So everything else is now in a function. And we're going to use two underlines, name, underline. And we'll figure out what those are for a little later. For now, just remember I got to do two of them. So if name is equal to main, so it's going to look for the function named main. If that's true, so if I find one, then we're going to just call main. So this is how we actually run our program. We start our program. The only code in what you might call this main line that's not in a function is this one line here. So we're going to run it again, make sure it still runs. And I did something with an indentation probably. What did I do here? Define main. Oh, forgot to put a colon there. And then I did something I did not like there. I'm not sure what right offhand because I can't hardly see it. Let me see here. Yeah. Oh, it didn't like my if. Hang on. There we go. I had a. So sometimes Python can be a little picky. I didn't actually put a space there. So now notice it's color coded, and I should have noticed that. So now we'll run it. And the median is none. Oh. So I didn't actually have anything returned here, so it actually printed none because we don't have that function in there yet. But so you should be able to grab this and take those other items, and now you know how to make functions. Now there's a lot of other things we can do with functions, and we'll work with them, but this is kind of an introduction. That returns whatever value back to where you called it. And here, when I'm calling that function, whatever's in parentheses, I pass into that function. So we're taking data in and out of this function and hopefully making it easier to use. All right, so that is 5.1, most of 5.1 anyway.